Welcome back, everybody. Today I'm going to show you a creative yet effective technique to identify the ad network that's providing you installs that do the best job to grow your digital audience, or DAU. So behind me, we're comparing two ad networks that are providing you installs that you paid for. And what we're doing is we're looking at the leading 15 days after installation and comparing the average days since last login between these two ad networks. So when it comes to average days since last login, we want that metric to be as low as possible. You want to have a DAU, or digital audience, where users are logging in day over day. So you want average days since last login to be 1 day or 2 days, or even 0 days, meaning they logged in day of. However, when it comes to installs, you know that retention is tough. Day one retention within the industry is about 35%, meaning 65% of installs that you pay for churn out immediately after the first interaction with your online business. So going back to the analysis behind me, I'm going to show you how to replicate this so you can apply it to your own business needs. But as you can see, between the two ad networks, the lower trend line, or the blue ad network, is greatly outperforming the orange ad network in terms of retention, because the average days since last login is considerably lower at 11 versus the other ad network at 13. So what this means is, if you look at the blue trend line, you'll notice that, okay, after 15 days, average days since last login is 11, meaning the average number of retained days is about 4, versus the orange trend line, where the average number of retained days is about 2. So that's 15 minus 13 being 2. So let's go ahead and go over to MySQL, and I'll show you exactly how to rebuild this exact same analysis in today's walkthrough so that you can apply it to your own business and capture these very same optimizations. And in addition, identify the ad network that is providing you the most installs that retain the best, and reinvest more of your user acquisition budget there. So let's go ahead and head over to MySQL. Okay, great. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to select the very first login date per customer ID, and that's going to effectively represent their install date. So we just need to do customer ID and then login date, and then just take the min on the login date. And we can rename this column to install date. And then we can group by customer ID. I'll show you the output. Okay, great. So here is each customer and their very first login date, which we renamed to their install date. Okay, so let's put that in a subselect. We can just call this installs. Okay, so the next step is, as of today's date, which is January 8th, 2025, we need to return some installs that have at least a leading 15 days of data. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring in installs from November of 2024. And we're picking November of 2024 to ensure that there's a leading 15 days that can be analyzed. If we picked, for example, December of 2024, there could be some installs December 31st, 2024 that don't have that full 15 days of data. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to do select from this subselect and bring in the columns. And here in the where clause is where we are going to filter for just installs that happen in November of 2024. So we will do a date format on the install date. And we're going to do %. And what that is going to do is take the install date, like September 15, 2024, and reset it to the first day of the month, so September 1st, 2024. And we're doing that because over on this side of the equation, we're going to use the current date function to get to November 1st, 2024, thereby filtering our installs for just November 2024. So we will take this exact sequence there, change that out to be the current date. And again, the current date is January 8th, 2025. So this statement here is going to change that value to be January 1st, 2025. Now we need to get this value to be November 1st, 2024. So to do that, we're going to do a simple date add interval -2 month. So it will take January 1st, 2025, bring it back to December 1st, 2024, and then bring it back to November 1st, 2024, hence the -2. Let me show you that this filtering worked. Okay, great. So as you can see here, all of our installs are from November of 2024 on different dates, but in the month of November in the year of 2024. Okay. So the very next thing we need to do is we only want to look at paid installs. So we're going to create another subselect that returns install dates by customer and their ad network. And then eventually in a later step, we will bring across the attribution network or the attribution name or the ad partner up here with this install data. So let's start building our second subselect. And lucky for us, we have an installs table, so it's called fact player installs. So here is all of our install data. As you can see, it's coming from organic and paid sources. So what we want to do is just look at our paid sources. So we will say where attribution network is not null. And as you can see, we're now filtering for just paid installs. Now, one thing we want to do is we want to select the very first install or install instance per customer. So we're going to do that now. I'm going to bring in the attribution name, which is the ad network name. And then we're going to build a window function so that we can mark or flag the very first install instance. We're going to do row number over partition by, so per customer. And then we're going to just order by the install date time ascendingly. So that the very first install has a value of 1, or the beginning of this index from this window function. We're going to call this install index. call this installs as well. Let me show you exactly what I'm doing here. So let's bring these fields up. And because this inner subselect is called installs, we need to add this prefix up here. And then to ensure that we're only taking the very first install instance, we're going to do this in the where clause. And let's run a few records now. Great, so we have each customer, their install date, and their attribution name. Let's get rid of this limit. And now we have two subselects. So we're gonna call this first one installs. And this second subselect network, because it has the ad network. And what we're gonna do is now join the two. We will do select. And we will bring up the fields, the customer ID, and the install date. And the only thing that's missing now is the ad network that the paid install came in on. And we're going to retrieve that from our second subselect called network. So to ensure that every single install has a corresponding ad network, what we're going to do is an inner join, meaning the customer and install date has to exist in both tables or both subselects. The customer and the install date must exist in subselect 1 and subselect 2 so that we can effectively bring across the attribution network. What that will mean is any installs that do not have an attribution network will be dropped after the inner join. So let's do it. We're going to do inner join. We're going to say on installs.customer ID equals network dot and installs.install date equals network.install date. And then from table 2 or from our second subselect, we're going to bring across the ad network or attribution name. So we're going to bring across this column right here. So we will do network dot attribution name. And we can rename this to ad network. Now, here is our entire query. Let me zoom in a little bit. And let's go ahead and run this inner join. Okay, great. So now we have installs from November of 2024, and we have their ad partner or attribution name or attribution network. This is perfect. So the next thing we need to do is bring in those leading dates so that we can analyze the leading or first 15 days after installation, and so that we can have the analysis aggregated by days since install and ad network. So let's call this entire subselect leading. Or let's just call this total installs. Okay, so let's bring up the fields from our previous or prior subselect and rename the prefix. Here we go. Now, the only thing we need to do is bring in those leading dates. So let me show you how to do that. We have a table called dim date, and it's got a column of dates. The dates are in the second column. My mistake, the table is called dim date. So after dropping the S, we can now successfully see a few records, and all those date values are in the second column. So let's go ahead and join to this table with a little bit of logic. So we will say, let's do a left join over to dim date. We can rename this table dates, and we'll do it on dates.date. So this table and this column right here called date has to be greater than or equal to the total installs install date. And that's going to bring across all dates that are greater than or equal to the install date for these paid November 2024 installs that have their ad network or attribution network or name. So let's go ahead and take this. We will add it here. And before running that, let's make sure that we bring in the right column name. Remember, we renamed attribution name to ad network, so we have to reference ad network instead of attribution name. Okay, let's run a few records now. Okay, great. So now we have each customer, their install date, and all dates that are greater than or equal to the install date from the installation date up through the present. So fantastic. That gives us our leading 15 days of data we need to do this analysis. Now, the very next thing we need to do is for each one of these leading dates for every install, we need to calculate the average days since their last login. So for each one of these leading dates where there's going to be at least 15, we need to calculate and recalculate for each leading date value the average days since this specific player logged in. Great, so let's do that now. We're going to call all of this leading dates. Let's make sure we change out the prefix again. And now the next thing we need to do to calculate average days since last login per date and the leading date column, we need to join over to fact player logins, which has login days per customer. Okay, great. A table of customers with each of their login dates. So we're going to do a left join over to this table now. We can rename this logins table, just logins. And we're going to join on the customer ID. And then we want the login date value for each of these customers to be less than or equal to this leading date value. And we're going to take the max of that login date value coming from table 2 as part of our join process. So we will do where logins.login date is less than or equal to leading dates dot date. Okay, so what's going to happen is as this join gets executed, all of these login dates for each customer that are less than or equal to this leading date value are going to come across, and it's going to be multiple records. And what we're trying to do is we want to calculate average days since last login relative to each of these leading date values that are changing. So what we want to do is say, hey, let's bring across all of this customer's logins or login dates that are less than or equal to this leading date value. And let's take the max or the very last time that they logged in relative to this leading date value right here. So let's do that. We will call this last login date. And we're doing a group by because, again, this join up here could potentially bring across multiple records, right? We're saying for this customer, bring in all login dates that are less than or equal to this leading date value right here. So that means multiple records could be brought across, but we only want the most recent time that they logged in relative to this leading date value. Hence, we're taking the max of the login date value from table 2 and grouping by these other fields up here. Okay, let's run a few records now. Okay, great. So we're looking at a customer right here ending in 1878. They installed November 1st, 2024 on Ad Network 16. And here are all the leading dates. So these values start at the install date and run up through the present so that we get those leading date values. Then for each of these leading date values, we are calculating and recalculating the last time that they logged in. And as you can see, the leading date values are increasing, but the last login date is the same. And that means that this is one of many players that installed and the last time that they logged in was their installation date, meaning they installed and then after their installation date no longer had any more subsequent interactions with your online business. Okay, great. So we're actually ready to aggregate all of our information now and nearly finish the work that we need to do here in MySQL. So I'm going to call this ag. And what we want to do is group by two things. We want to group by the ad network and then by day since install, which is our x-axis in the analysis. So we will do a date diff between the ag.date and the ag.install date. We'll call this days since install. And remember, we want to analyze these two ad networks or multiple ad networks side by side for the first 15 days after installation. And then what we want to do is not group by, but aggregate by the total number of days since last login. So we're going to change the install date out for last login date. And then we're just going to sum this. Days since last login. And because that metric is an aggregation, we want to divide it over a total count of installs. So we will simply do a count here and call this installs. And again, we just want to group by two things, and that's going to be down here. Let me clean up this query here. We will put a semicolon there, and we will delete everything below that. So let's go ahead and check our work. So we have the last login date coming from table 2, and up here we're doing our aggregations. So we want to group everything by two dimensions, which is the ad network and the x-axis, which is days since install. We're doing a count so that we have a total number of installs, and then we're doing a summation. Within that summation, we are calculating days since last login. And the idea is we're going to take days since last login and divide it by installs, and then we're going to kind of visualize that by ad network and days since install so that we can identify the ad network that gives you the absolute best retention. Okay, let's run our final query now. Okay, great. So here's our data. Let's go ahead and move it over to Excel. All right, so here we are in Excel. All we need to do is create one calculated field, let average days since last login, and that's going to be the total days since last login divided by the total number of installs so that we can get an average. Let's turn this into a whole number here. And let's go ahead and transform this data. We will transpose it a little bit in a pivot table. We're going to put days since last login here on the rows, the attribution name here across the top, average days since last login there in the pivot table. We're going to remove the grand totals. We're going to do a label filter. So less than or equal to 15 days. We just want to look at the leading 15 days. And we have all of these ad networks here with their retention performance. Great. So now what I'm going to do is isolate the two ad networks that we were looking at earlier. So this is ad network 4 up here, and then ad network 3. And remember, the lower the value for this metric, the better. So this lower blue trend line is where we're going to be reallocating our user acquisition budget, because this ad network does way better at retaining users. Okay, great. Let me add some data labels here. Let's reformat these just a little bit. We will turn these into numbers and just remove these decimal places. Turn this into a number, remove the decimal places. And let's expand the size a little bit here. Let's thicken these lines just a tad. And then let's work on making both our horizontal and vertical axis a little larger so that everyone can see. Okay, so this is a great analysis, because what you can do is you can look at fairly recent installs. So we picked installs from November 2024, and we looked at the leading 15 days after they installed, and we're segmenting it by ad network. And from their installation date, we're calculating their average days since last login. Now, for that metric, again, you want the number to be as low as possible. So in this example, between these two ad networks, ad network 3, or the blue ad network, has a much lower average days since last login as compared to the orange ad network, or upper trend line. So thank you so much for joining me in today's tutorial. Again, I think this is a really fantastic way for a user acquisition team or a marketing team to identify ad networks that give you the absolute best retention, so that you can do a much better job of growing your DAU or digital audience. Thank you so much for joining. I hope this was helpful.